So tonight I'm very excited to welcome Andrew Weiss to talk about his new book, Accidental Czar, which is the rare combination of graphic novel and biography, illustrated by Brian Box Brown. The Accidental Czar in the title is Vladimir Putin, and the book chronicles his rise from mid-level KGB officer to the Russian presidency to comic book villain. And it couldn't be more timely. Today's actually the launch day for the book, and this afternoon he was on All Things Considered, where he spoke to Mary Louise Kelly, and he described his book as seriously quirky. Weiss is the James Family Chair and Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he oversees research on Russia and Eurasia. He's served in various policy roles at the National Security Council, the State Department, and the Pentagon. He's going to be in conversation this evening with Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, who served as the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, as well as to the Republic of Armenia and the Kyrgyz Republic. She's also the author of a memoir, Lessons from the Edge, and we have lots of copies of her book as well behind the registers, and she's happy to sign. So please pick up copies of both books and help me welcome Andrew Weiss and Ambassador Yovanovitch.
So welcome to everybody here tonight. I think we're in for a real treat in finding out more about this book. So when Andrew told me that he was writing a book, his first book, and it was going to be a nonfiction graphic novel, I was kind of shocked, to tell you the truth, because, here he is, this expert on Russia, international affairs, and he's doing a graphic novel. And I thought, am I the only one who is so uncool that I've never read a graphic novel? But I'm not going to make you show hands as to who else has not read a graphic novel. But now I have read one, Andrew's, and I'm telling you, you should line up and buy it because it is great. You will learn about Putin. You will learn about Russia. You will learn about the last 30 years of international affairs. And, I kind of consider myself to be an expert in some of these things as well. And I learned a lot from this book. And so I highly, highly recommend it. So my first question, though, since we're in Washington, is going to be about process. How did you decide to write a nonfiction graphic novel? Who was your audience? What was the process working with, this very renowned illustrator? I mean, tell us about that.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Masha, for being here tonight, and thank you to Politics and Prose for hosting us. And it's so great to see so many friends in the audience here with us tonight. The process for writing a graphic novel is different than writing a memo. And that was the first thing I had to learn. What was really interesting to me was when I first started to think about this was I really knew nothing about what graphic novel writing involved. And I had to put together scenes. The book is basically a collection of scenes, but then you have to partner with someone because I don't know how to draw. And I had this very inspiring partner, Brian Brown, who goes by Box Brown, and he's written several amazing graphic novels of his own. He's never drawn one for someone else. And so when I would I would write out these scenes and share them with Brian, I would give him suggestions of things that I thought would illustrate the point I was trying to make, but I was really, really, really focused on let's avoid visual cliches. No Matryoshka dolls, none of these things that people, constantly fall back on as shorthand for Russia. And when Brian would turn it around, he would come up with things that were entirely in keeping with someone who's written books about Andre the Giant and things like that. He's not a foreign policy nerd. And there are these combinations of images in the book, and the one that I'm most fond of, if I can just show it to everyone, is he took these very gloomy atmospheric photos I showed him of the Berlin Wall, and he then sort of put Putin sort of skulking around in a trench coat in front of the Berlin Wall as the cover. And it was just an ideal encapsulation to me of what working with someone as brilliant as Brian was all about.
And so why did you decide to write a graphic novel as opposed to what I would have assumed you would do, which is, a very serious foreign policy tome. And I would add, there's a 10-page bibliography, so this is a serious foreign policy tome.
Yeah, definitely. Everyone should read the footnotes first. But what I was trying to do was I thought there were about 3 key audiences that I really wanted to reach. The first one was for people who are obviously paying attention to Putin, who has this outsized impact on the world today and on pretty much everyone's life. But people who are following the news might not really understand either the arc of his own life, the arc of Russian history, and the arc of the experience of someone who really was a mediocre mid-level operative who lucked into the job of a lifetime and who has played it fabulously from his perspective. And he's been on this incredible winning streak up until February 24th. The other audience that I thought was really important to reach were young people and people in my line of work and think tanks and policy world. We're pretty insular. We're generally speaking to each other and either, convincing each other of things, or more often than not convincing each other of things. And I thought it was really important to sort of give young people a better grounding in who Putin is and how he got to be in this grudge match against the United States. And just one thing which I sort of, as I did the research for this that I had forgotten, which Masha, maybe you remember, is that after 9/11, Putin was the first foreign leader to call President Bush, and he became George W. Bush's buddy. And that relationship of being America's buddy also included getting to sit in on one of the CIA's presidential daily briefings for the president and getting his own copy. And he sort of autographed it and handed it back to the CIA briefer at the end. But again, just to imagine the arc of someone who was, for his own reasons, it was all very self-serving when he wanted to be America's buddy, but to where we are today. So I thought young people really needed to know that. And then lastly, coming back to the joke about the footnotes, was for wonks and practitioners to kind of dredge up things about Putin's personal story, as well as how we got into this incredible grudge match with him that would sort of give my particular take on who he is.
Mm-hmm. So who is he? I mean, when he came to power, as you said, he's sort of an accidental president by all accounts. So I've always thought of him as, being relatively careful and so forth. You make a pretty compelling case that he's actually a hothead, has always been a hothead, is not a master political strategist. And so I'm wondering if you can talk to us about that a little bit. And then when he came to the presidency in the year 2000, was he an empty vessel? Everybody, poured their desires into him and he kind of moved forward? Or did he have well thought out views and ideas about how he was going to move forward?
So 3 quick points. When Vladimir Putin came into office, everyone should remember, Russia was being run by a total booze hound who couldn't show up for work most of the time, Boris Yeltsin. And so the key goal when Putin was installed was to ensure continuity, that the people who had been around the Yeltsin entourage and Yeltsin's own family would be protected. And they wanted someone who they felt would basically live up to that unwritten understanding that they could keep their ill-gotten gains. They also needed to show the Russian people that there was a sober man of action on the job who could protect their country. And that's why you see all these ridiculous images early in Putin's career of wearing sailor suits and flying in the cockpit of jet fighters and stuff and parading around with guns. It was to kind of create an image of there's a decent, normal person in charge after a while. And the image that they built for him was all based on pop culture. And there was a kind of dashing man of the silver screen who was named Vyacheslav Tikhonov, who was Russia's George Clooney, basically, or the Soviet Union's George Clooney. And he'd played a deep cover KGB operative who wormed his way into the top ranks of the SS in World War II. And so they were deliberately modeling all of this after these things they knew would appeal to average Russians. For our purposes, I don't think we really got, and I put myself in this category as someone who was part of the team dealing with Putin at the beginning of his career in the senior ranks of the Russian leadership, how much the thing that motivated him the most was the notion of having a strong state. And there's this Russian word, государственник, which means believer in a strong state, and that the interest of the state and having a strong authority trumps everything else, the roles of individuals or rule of law. And then the last thing, which I think we didn't totally get about Putin, was that as the winning streak continued and Russia became fabulously wealthy, it had a series of geopolitical successes, they would become more and more convinced that the United States was in an inexorable decline, and that we were going to be the losers and countries like Russia were going to be the winners. And that fed a level of hubris and overconfidence. And we can come to that in a second, but I think that's a big part of how we ended up in the mess we're in today.
Yeah. So when I look back, and you mentioned this, the idea of Bush and Putin as being, if not best buddies, at least having a partnership, a collaborative partnership. And, when I think back to that time, I think, there was a moment, maybe I was deluding myself, but there was a moment where it seemed that Russia perhaps could become a working democracy, or at least more liberal. Was that all a delusion? Was he just leading us on, the master spy master, or was there a moment there?
So people like you and I worked really hard to try to help Russia in this horrible period of the 1990s and to sort of bring Russia into the mainstream. But I think what totally corroded any of that was a sense on the Russian side that the goal of U.S. power is to basically knock off regimes that we don't like. And the idea, which runs throughout the book, of basically the United States going around the world and launching grassroots revolutions, which in the Russian terminology are called color revolutions, starting in 2003, and then most spectacularly in Ukraine in 2004, that this is the thing that most animates Putin's view of the United States and deepest fear, that he will be hauled in front of a mob and either, sent to jail or something worse. And he saw this in Yugoslavia in the fall of Milosevic. And I can remember quite vividly being at the White House and seeing how devastating it was for the Russians to see their ally Milosevic go down in flames after a student-led movement to remove him. And one of the things that I found in the book, just coming back to the nerdy part of the book, was this great interview with President Clinton about the covert action finding he signed, and basically using covert action as a tool for encouraging the student uprising. And so I can bet, I don't have any proof, but I would certainly bet that the Russians were onto this U.S. level of involvement in the student uprising in Serbia. And that created a view that I think is, still deeply held today, that the United States is aiming for nothing less than Putin's ouster, and that that's the ultimate goal of U.S. policy.
And you think that continues to animate Putin today?
Absolutely.
So what should we do about that?
Well, I don't think you can ever now, given the amount of blood on Putin's hands, given the horrible crimes that have been committed in Ukraine, to reassure him, you get to keep your day job. If you back out of Ukraine and we go back to the world that existed on February 23rd, all is forgiven. I think, he's now backed himself into a horrible corner here, and that's what makes the situation so dangerous. Yeah,
it certainly is. So, just going back to Putin the man and Putin the myth, I mean, we know these stories about Putin who, talks about the rat that is in a corner, and that rat is the most dangerous. And so now all of us here in Washington are like, oh my God, is Putin the rat? And is he most dangerous now because he's kind of cornered? Can you talk a little bit about these myths that have been established? I recall that when I was working for the government, we would have to remind ourselves that just remember, the Russians aren't 10 feet tall, that all of these myths out there, Putin riding, with a bare chest on a big old horse, somebody so powerful and so virile. And yet somehow, even as we kind of made fun of that, we were buying into that myth.
No, so the rat story is a good one, and my friend Bob is here somewhere. He's always pointed out to me that the rat story is ambiguous, because in the our telling of the rat story, he's running around the apartment building where he grew up, and he's chasing rats for fun. And one day he chases a rat into the corner, and he's got a stick, and the rat jumps on him, and Putin learns this lesson of don't corner a rat because that's dangerous. But as my friend points out, he backed off. That he didn't keep chasing the rat. And so, he wimped out. So there is a kind of interesting ambiguity to that story. But for us, the danger is that the Russians are so good at getting in our heads And they're so good at scaring us or planting ideas in our heads that, for example, right now we're all worried about, which is the threat of some kind of nuclear use in Ukraine. The question is, what's the goal of getting us all to think about and talk about this? And that's basically what everyone's been doing for the past 3 or 4 weeks after the Russians brought this issue out. I mean, I have a pet theory on this, which is they believe that there's a button on Joe Biden's desk which allows him to turn up and down the level of violence in Ukraine, and that the Ukrainians are simply our proxies, which again denies them the status of being the, creators of their own destiny, and also having control over the fact that they're fighting for their survival. So, but again, the Russians have brought this issue to the fore, and then we spend, an inordinate amount of time, as you say, buying into the things that they want us to talk about. And we end up, in many ways, we just don't have the same discipline about that they bring to the table.
Right. So after, as you pointed out, I mean, it's been weeks of, these hints and actually even months of hints about possible use of tactical nuclear weapons, which is, I think, terrifying to probably everybody in this room, just even thinking about that. And yet over the last couple of, maybe it's over the last week, the Russians seem to be backing off of that a little bit. Putin saying, what? No, I would never use nuclear weapons. I mean, that's a little exaggerated on my part, but tell us about that, the ability, because it seems that Putin can turn it on and off too.
Yeah, well, there's a great quality to Russian leaders, and you do a very good Putin impersonation, I should add, is that there's this concept of lying, but there's also the kind of, I'm lying, and I know that I'm lying. And that is also always going on. And I think that's what's made dealing with Putin so hard over the past 8 years when the war started, is that he just would not accept basic facts and expected us to kind of be able to talk to him when he would deny that Russia had ever invaded Ukraine, or that there was Russian control over the separatists, or so-called separatists, who were operating in eastern Ukraine. And I think it's that inability now to have a normal conversation with him that's going to make this crisis all the more dangerous, because we can't have lines of communication that are productive. And then if you chase after someone who is full of it and who has no interest in a normal conversation, you look weak. And I think that's what's, basically in part holding back the United States or other Western countries. Like, no one wants to be the one that looks like they're ready to be duped or trust someone like Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. So I do want to come back to this question of, has Putin changed over time? Is he still the same man he was when he was an idealistic, young intelligence officer, or have there been changes?
So 2 parts of that. One is probably my single favorite Brian Brown drawing in this whole book is something that I was told by a senior Western official about what was so maddening about dealing with Putin. And it was the fact that there are, I'm sorry, I'm going to struggle to find this.
Do you want me to hold you?
No, I'm cool. Thank you, Masha. The problem is there are 3 hemispheres of Putin's brain. And I think we just need to remember that these hemispheres exist. The first one is filled with all the garbage, lies, and conspiracies that he's fed.
202.
Page 202. Thanks,
Yeah,
Masha.
he's getting to a later question.
Okay. But so in this picture that Brian drew, which everyone, I'm sure in the back, you can all see it. Sorry, I was just kidding. Is these 3 hemispheres of his brain. And the first one is just all the nonsense that he gets from the KGB and the career bureaucracy that fosters sort of the pseudo-history and conspiracy that he's marinating himself in all the time. The second hemisphere of his brain are his own experiences and the things that he's participated in over more than 2 decades in power. And so he's very experienced. He's cut a lot of deals. He's been at the top table of global leaders, and he runs circles, frankly, around a lot of global leaders who aren't as experienced as he is. And then lastly, the third hemisphere is the real world, and it's the one that we all live in. And the problem with dealing with Putin is he toggles back and forth in the series of a single conversation between the different hemispheres, and you never really know if you all share, a baseline and common understanding.
And does he know where he is at any given moment? I mean, that sounds like a ridiculous question, but
I don't think it's possible to know. I mean, because so much of what he stands for is artifice or invented or embellished or self-serving. He has an intense level, as our former boss, Bill Burns, likes to say, he harbors these intense grievances and grudges. So he wears that on his sleeve. Some of that is real and some of it's totally self-serving. So just to take one example of that, there's this constant, and it comes back to the question of how the Russians are good at making us think in the terms that are beneficial to them. This notion that Russia was humiliated and that Russia's a humiliated power, like that is something that the Russian government has indoctrinated into all everyday life through the media and through other forms of propaganda to make Russians feel aggrieved. And I have no reason to doubt that average people do feel that the Soviet Union was a great superpower and now it's not, and that that's unpleasant. But this notion that, you know, Russia has a grudge against the West is very convenient to him because it fosters a sense that the world's out to get them and that through unity and sort of standing up to the opponents of Russia outside of Russia, Russia will be great again. And that's, you know, the rallying point for that happens to be Vladimir Putin. So it's all very, you know, deliberate and beneficial to him and his power.
Right, right. And so, you know, it seems that and you go into this in the book in some detail, it seems that the Russian identity is a negative as opposed to a positive, you know, not our people and those others that are not ours, наши, не наши.
Yeah, no, this is a great concept, and I don't want to get too deep in sociology, but one of the sort of leading forces in Russian sociology is in the book, sort of explains how because Russia's and what defines Russia and what defines Russianness has always been opaque and unclear throughout most of modern history, it's a lot easier for Russians to identify themselves with things they're not. They're not in favor of LGBT equality. They're not in favor of the kind of normal Western values that we all embrace. Part of this is self-serving, again, because what Putin wants is he wants to portray his opponents as people who are not normal Russians. And so this "ni nash," not one of us, concept is very beneficial. And it's been, you know, something that the Russians have used time and time again. Like when he says that the US organized protests in 2011, 2012, it was an easy way to say, those aren't middle-class normal people. Those are State Department paid proxies. And they want things that you don't want. You know, they want a Russia that you could never abide. And we see this today with all the kind of ludicrous propaganda the Russians are pumping out about Nazis and Ukraine and the fight against Satanism and all these other things. Like it all is aimed at appealing to a sort of Joe Sixpack Russian voter who lives out of the cosmopolitan parts of Russia and who are Putin's base voters ultimately.
But is there a positive Russian vision of the future, or is it all like negative and to a certain extent looking backwards to Russian Empire days?
I think that Putin has laurels to rest on. And if he had played his cards differently and he had not been so impulsive in 2014 in starting this war, and then had not been such an opportunist in expanding the war in 2022, he would go down in history as a leader who had overseen Russia's revival. The country was in horrible shape when he took over in 1999. It grew significantly wealthier and more stable and more prominent on the world stage. And it was respected again on the world stage to a degree. But by basically being obsessed with Ukraine, and I mean, I'm sort of curious what you think about this. What is it about Ukraine that made him want to torpedo all of that? He's destroyed his economy. He's tarnished his record. He's turned himself into an international pariah. He has basically removed the benefits of globalization that Russia enjoyed for the past 3+ decades. Over what? And what is it about Ukraine that is this thing that is so important to him? And what is it that he can't control about himself that has led him into this series of epic miscalculations and blunders? So if you can, if you can expound on that, we can do a book together.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I think it's the idea of empire. I mean, Russia without Ukraine is not an empire, and I think that is an animating feature not only for Russia of today, but of Russia in previous years as well. And I think that he didn't think it would end up like this. He made 3 serious miscalculations about the strength of the Russian military, about the strength and the unity of the Ukrainian people, and the leadership of President Zelensky. And he also misunderstood, I think, the U.S. and the West, and the fact that we were able to come together and support Ukraine in meaningful and strong and consistent ways.
Could I just build on that? Agreeing 100% with what you just said. The one other piece which I think is missing from the analysis is how much the notion of not having natural boundaries and not being protected matters in the calculus of the Russian leadership. And this, in our scholarly work at Carnegie is a key theme of our work, that the fact that Russia views buffers as providing strategic depth against external opponents has been an animating force in their history. And one of the great factoids that's in the book, which I credit to historian Stephen Kotkin, is the notion that starting in the era of Ivan the Terrible, the Russian Empire grew at a rate of about 50 square miles per day for centuries. And it was that expansionism that provided the modicum of safety that Russian czars and now Vladimir Putin have always sought.
Yeah. Although, I mean, ironically, what the Russians may have perceived as safety has also created intense resentment, I think I'm putting that mildly, among other peoples and other countries. And we're seeing that now. The expansion of NATO, to include even Finland and Sweden now, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, where on the one hand, this was all supposed to keep Russia safer, and yet those actions have boomeranged back and are making Russia, in their own view at least, I mean, I don't think that NATO is a threat to Russia, but in their own view at least, less secure. So, it's kind of an interesting dilemma for Russia. I did want to ask you, so in the book, you make pretty clear that Putin, and I think Putin himself has made this clear, that he certainly doesn't see Ukraine as an independent country, an independent people. They are clearly just proxies for the U.S., and we're telling them what to do. And he makes pretty clear that he's at war with the United States. And, if we didn't know it before with I swore I wasn't going to say the word elections tonight, but I'm forced to say the word. The sort of the meddling in our 2016 elections, the disinformation that is everywhere, including today about the war in Ukraine, sort of all of the different kinds of Soviet and now post-Soviet plays that the Russian government is using against us. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the Soviet playbook that we are seeing reanimated and how we should respond to that.
So,
because, I mean, I think we don't want to be at war with Russia, right?
Yeah, but you're right. This is the way they define it. Part of it is self-serving because it, justifies the need for everyone to donate their children to go fight in this horrible criminal war in Ukraine. But I think it does reflect a mindset that the stakes are existential for them, and that this may end really badly for Vladimir Putin, and that the West has now really gone in to support Ukraine at levels of support that I'm sure for you would have been unfathomable given the way U.S. policy was developing before February 24th. The question in my mind about what we are going to be facing is, one, as you said earlier, we should not make Russia 10 feet tall. And we should not pretend that they are super spies and that they know the formula for undermining our democracy. We're doing a good job right now undermining our democracy without their help. And they amplify things, they're important on the margins, but they're not the authors of that. Second is a lot of the tools, as you allude to, that they do use are clumsy, they're Soviet in origin, and they're intended, if anything, to play with us and get us to be thinking about them as much as they are intended to disrupt and harm us and the unity of the transatlantic community that the United States is the leader of. And so over this, and you can probably know this better than I, after our election in 2016, the light bulb went off in pretty much every European capital of like, wow, we have a problem here. We have a country that plays dirty, that's going to amplify extreme voices in our societies, that's going to promote populism or radical left groups, and we need to make sure that we track it and we watch it. Some of that will always be, as another colleague of ours mentioned, it'll be like oxygen. Like, we're not going to uninvent disinformation. That will always exist. But there are things that we have to do to harden our democracy, and that means making sure the election machinery is more secure And that has, somewhat, that there's been significant progress on that. We need to protect people against the kind of hack and leak operations that hurt Hillary Clinton in 2016, where, people's dirty laundry are dumped out into the public domain. But the Russians are able to do these things because they're cheap, because they're asymmetrical. They kind of level the playing field with a much stronger US, and because they're like a lottery ticket. You never know. One of these things might pay off. And Donald Trump's election, which is a big focus of the last chapter of the book, is probably the most spectacular lottery ticket Russia ever bought.
Yeah. And it's also deniable.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. So, what kinds of tools should we be looking at to deal with Russia? I mean, should we be looking back at our Cold War playbook, the idea of soft power, the radios, other things?
The Russian people are now cut off from the world increasingly, although, a great number of younger people are using special technologies that I'm not that good at myself, like VPNs and anonymizers, to get access to information. We are very fortunate to work at the Carnegie Endowment, and our Russian colleagues at the Carnegie Endowment publish great analysis every day. And so there are brave Russians out there who are doing smart things and who are sort of sharing analytical, objective information. We shouldn't fool ourselves, though, that reaches everyone in Russia, because most Russians are depoliticized, apathetic, and atomized. And so there isn't the same hunger or interest. And there's also this cultural norm, and I'm a little wary of stereotyping. But in Russia, and I think this is one of the key differences between Russia and Ukraine, and hopefully you can amplify this, Masha, in a lot of Russian minds, everything's out of their hands. There's this notion, and you yourself are Russian, of avos, and that sort of God will will it, or God will decide it. And you see that since the heyday of the Yeltsin era, when people did show up and did take agency for the country's future, Putin has kind of indicated, it's never going to work. Like, you can't out menace me. I'm really tough, and I'm going to, scare the hell out of you. And two, even if you try, it won't work. And so it has fed this level of apathy and, sort of willful passivity on the part of average Russians. And Ukrainians are just different. And Ukrainians, now multiple times in 1991 and 2014 in the Orange Revolution, in the 2004 in the Orange Revolution, then 2014 in the Revolution of Dignity, and now most vividly in the defense of their country, they're all in, right? And I mean, you were in Ukraine somewhat recently, and you can, it's unimaginable to me that Russian society could mobilize itself in the same way Ukrainians have. And it just highlights the difference between those two similar but very different groups of people.
Yeah. I think that was very well said. But I think it does also kind of lay out how big the challenge is as we move forward. I mean, one of the things that you write in the foreword to your book is that we need to do a better job of managing Putin. And so I'm wondering if you have any words of advice for, those who might be with the U.S. government here for how we do that.
It's really hard. And I think the Biden administration has been really careful to not build expectations that, with a frank conversation, we can sort this out, and to really focus on guardrails, that there are a couple things that are really scary and really dangerous, namely getting into a direct war with Russia or the use of things like nuclear weapons on the battlefield, but also showing that we're not going to put up with things that we might have in previous eras been willing to accept. And so the notion that Russia gets to decide the fate of Ukraine, that's not something we're going to tolerate anymore. We are going to provide military assistance to the people of Ukraine to defend themselves. These are all game changer type decisions. And as much as all of us, particularly former State Department people, think maybe there's a conflict that could be resolved at the bargaining table, that's not going to happen here. This war is largely going to get resolved on the battlefield. And Russia is being shredded right now on the battlefield, and that creates new dangers. And I think the Biden administration has to be focused on what extent does Ukrainian audacity and success on the battlefield trigger some of the escalatory spirals that we really want to avoid. And that's a horribly complicated balancing act that they need to be mindful of.
Well, so maybe that will spark some questions in this audience. I'm sure that many of you have lots of questions for Andrew, and so if you could
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can bring a mic to you, or okay. All right.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed both of your remarks. I'm an Italo-American citizen. 100 years ago, Benito Mussolini marched on Rome. And 100 years later, a woman who comes from the far right and the fascist Fratelli d'Italia, or Sons of Italy party, is now the head of government. For 30 years, a vignettist or a cartoonist named Giannelli has used humor, the same humor that you use, or cartoons, to destroy, for example, both Meloni, the woman in power, and Berlusconi, for example. A picture of the Vatican, roof with the two fingers pointing at each other and touching, with Berlusconi naked but with high heels, and Meloni naked like this, and they're touching, and the caption is Padre Eterno, I made you, right? And that has done more to reduce Berlusconi, who's called Berlusca, than anything you can imagine in Italy. Therefore, I have ex-students in Germany, France, Britain, Ireland, Holland, Poland, Serbia, Croatia, and now, and know, along with my wife, Romanians, Ukrainians, and Russians who have left their country because they're one step away from famine. There is no employment for young people. They're living around inflation and what's called NIT, or not employed, educated or trained, and have lost hope. And
Could you
and my
ask
my question is, how can young people afford a book like your own, which costs 1.7 euro per page? I agree with what you said, but I have people who would love to read what you wrote.
No, thank you so much. Probably the single most exciting thing that happened when I wrote this book was when the Library Guild selected it. And it just reminded me, and my kids are both here, it reminded me of the centrality of libraries in our culture and the role that they play, and especially educating young people.
Yeah, that's so true. It certainly played a huge part in my upbringing. So if I could just ask people to identify themselves, but also to ask short questions.
My name is Jack. I'm a student at American University. My question is, you guys talked about myths about Vladimir Putin. What was his initial response to the way the West would react when he invaded Putin? Is it true that he was locked down during COVID and decided to invade because he was irrational? How did he think the West would react?
Really quick, Putin spent the pandemic in this weird work from home situation where he isolated himself from his team, from the Russian people, played a lot of hockey with his bodyguards, and bought into a lot of pseudo history. And he wrote this crazy essay, this unfounded, inaccurate essay, a treatise. And he laid it all out, that this would be the crowning moment of his legacy. And we wrote a scholarly paper about this called Putin's Unfinished Business that came out about exactly a year ago. But he's an opportunist, and he saw what happened in Afghanistan in the summer of 2021. He saw Angela Merkel's departure, and so he felt Europe would be less of a force to push back. He thought the US would be less of a force to push back. And the Zelensky government at that time was mired in all sorts of trouble. And the reality, sad reality, in 2014, 2015 is when conventional Russian military force was applied against the Ukrainians really got battered very badly. But what he did not calculate was the extent to which his military modernization program was founded on a lot of corrupt and inadequate programs, as well as the sheer creativity and moxie of the Ukrainians, and the fact that the United States would come in so hard and heavy behind them.
Good evening. I'm Alan Cyprus. A few moments ago, you described a profound difference in the cultures between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Russians, you talked about their passivity. The Ukrainians, you said they've risen repeatedly to defend their national interests. What accounts for those profound cultural differences between those two peoples?
That's a great question for Masha.
I think there are a lot of Ukrainians in the room who could probably answer it better, but over to you, Andrew.
No. This is, I think there is a unique capacity for self-organization and for autonomy and non-centralized decision-making in Ukraine. That's been a strength and a weakness at times. There is also the very, I think, serious memory of suffering and being victim of bigger empires that did violent, horrible things to the people of Ukraine at different stages of their history. And then there's the fact that they've seen that doing stuff matters, and that their vote against the continued survival of the Soviet Union in 1991 basically spelled the death of the Soviet Union. It was the final, most important death blow. And they saw that when the Russians tried to, monkey with their election in 2004 and install Viktor Yanukovych, that when they stood up in the street and demanded a rerun of their election, their involvement mattered. And same in 2014, that, what started sort of as a group of young students angry about somewhat obscure diplomatic discussion about bringing European Union and Ukraine together, it was when the police beat the hell out of those students that hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians came out on the street and stood up to a dictator and said, you can't do that to our kids. And, again, we've seen time and again in Russia, and this comes back to what we were talking before, that the Russian government is so smart and so selective about how they apply violence. And they don't need to do things en masse, but that if they target it carefully and then let that person who's been the victim, like the poet who was raped by the police recently, that you just let him go back out and tell his story to the public, it will have a chilling effect on everybody else. And that it's, basically you do these demonstrably horrible things a couple of times and everyone else will get the message they need to fall in line.
Thank you.
I'm just going to add one thing. I agree with everything that you said, but there's one other thing that is sort of, I think kind of summarizes it. So the national bard of Ukraine is a guy named Taras Shevchenko, and his most famous line is "Fight on, and you will prevail." And I think that every Ukrainian school child learns that verse, and now they're living it.
Hi, Michael Kimmage. Congratulations, Andrew. I have a question about the genre of book. So Putin is among the most photographed people in the world, and he certainly controls or tries to control his national, international sort of reputation through imagery. So I'm curious about the graphic novel that you've done, which is obviously not a Putin control set of images, and how you've worked with images in a sense to tell a different story from the one that we've all been inundated with from all of this public photography and image making.
Well, great to see you, Michael, and you were a huge inspiration and help in writing this book. I think that the problem with the Putin image pollution is that it's omnipresent and that we over-literalize it, if that's a word, and believe in it, and then make conclusions that affect everybody. So it was really important to me in this book that I would not take cheap shots, that I would be respectful and not mock Russia or mock him, but that I would not buy into the way he's depicted. And so, for example, the way Putin wasn't, at the beginning of his career, self-confident in a lot of these posed photos with the guns and in the sailor suit and stuff like that. There's this great line from one of his advisors, which is at the beginning, he just wasn't really comfortable swearing in public and being coarse, but eventually he grew into the role. And there's this kind of point in the book where this former PR guy says, like, he's now basically playing that role by heart, and he's playing the image back at us. And I think the other part of it, which I hope you see in the book, over the arc of his career, and this comes from a guy who was a dear friend of several of us in the room, a former diplomatic colleague of ours who lived in Moscow for a long time, is that if you had been treated as Putin has been for 20 odd years as the boss, and in Russian there's a great term for this, which is pakhan, which basically means like the boss of the group of thieves, like you start to imbue that in your own behavior. And I think that is also a big part of what we're dealing with, is someone whose self-confidence and sense of himself has greatly expanded, especially as his long, winning streak played out over the last 20 years.
It does make you wonder if he'll read the book. I mean, apparently Hitler watched The Great Dictator twice. So.
You could send it to him, Andrew.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Isaiah Smith, and I bring you greetings from Traverse City, Michigan. Jack Siegel and
oh wow,
yeah, he's told
oh
me
wow,
to give you his best.
Fabulous.
So, for a number of years, Putin was talking about the leadership in Ukraine, and we sort of turned our back, or we didn't listen. We didn't believe that he would actually go to war. Do you think we missed a chance to perhaps prevent the war?
I think that we've always had other priorities, and dealing with the role that Russia would play in its neighborhood has often been seen as complicating for us, in part because we didn't think what was happening in Russia's immediate neighborhood was as important to whatever the issue was at the moment, whether it was the war on terror, arms control, the supply corridor to Afghanistan. Like, we've always been very good at managing our inbox and kind of prioritizing the issues of the day. And when the Russians would come to us, I mean, you can probably challenge this, and said, we really need to talk about Ukraine, we were often like, that's not really your business, and thanks for your interest, but it's not something we're prepared to talk to you about because they're a sovereign country, and thank you for your interest in national security. But the reality was they were dead serious about this, and they learned after the war in Georgia in 2008, and then again in the war in 2014, the first phase of the war, that when a nuclear superpower acts deranged and uses armed force to get its way, a lot of countries back off. And sort of the analogy to me about all this was that no one really ever wanted to go toe-to-toe with Vladimir Putin. Like, it's too scary. And it's like the drunk guy in the bar who comes up to you and starts bothering you. You kind of want to, sneak out the back door. And I think that was in part what was going on for much of this time.
But isn't it true also that we kind of overestimated the power of Russia and its army?
Yes, no, and I think there's going to be, a need. People like myself really got that one wrong and really thought that the Russians would be able to, create facts on the ground in Ukraine like they had done in Syria and other places rather quickly. And, that was spectacularly not the case.
Thank you.
Matt? Hi, my name is Max Abu Leben, and my friend and I are actually here from the east coast of Canada. We came on a road trip all the way to DC. So yeah, staying with some friends in DC as well who are here. My question for you both tonight is about a letter written by the Progressive Caucus recently, which I'm sure you might be familiar with. But a couple weeks back, I believe it was 30 House Democrats signed a letter calling for President Biden to engage in direct diplomacy with Vladimir Putin and perhaps bring up the issue of sanctions relief should Russia ease the war efforts or stop the invasion in a sense. And that letter was rescinded the next day. There was a big backlash. And I'm wondering what kind of inside forces within the Democratic Party and the U.S. government more broadly might have caused such a backlash when this letter was genuinely expressed and legitimate in a certain sense, calling for what it was. It was very mildly worded diplomatic sentiment.
Thanks for the question. So I wish I knew a lot about U.S. domestic politics, and so I can, truthfully say I don't. I'm sure there are genuine worries in all sorts of American households and in political circles about where this is going. And I understand why it's horrible to watch every day a war that's going to grind on and cause so much misery. And then the question always is, can we do something about it? And Americans love to try to fix problems. It's kind of what makes our society so great. But in this particular case, it is not up to the United States to somehow mandate that people who are suffering unbelievable hardship and quasi-genocidal attacks sit down at the bargaining table and carve up their country. So I think that was a miscast idea. The problem is the other part of this, which is I think everyone in this room sees what's happening in Ukraine and also knows that Vladimir Putin has never been up for a diplomatic solution. He has tried to dominate countries in his neighborhood and play hard to do it, and he's never negotiated in good faith. So anyone who thinks that the U.S. hasn't tried to do that needs to sort of look at the diplomatic history of this. And our colleagues at the State Department and Masha herself spent a lot of time talking to the Russians after the war began in 2014 about here's some ways we could maybe stabilize things, and here's some ways we could fuzz up the status of the contested parts of Ukraine that you claim ownership of or want to have control over. And at no point did the Russians want sanctions or relief or any of these things so much that they were willing to talk seriously to the United States or the European partners that the United States worked with. So that is the reality. And I don't think we're anywhere close to the bargaining table. And we may not, we may end up in a world where this war goes on and on and on, and we end up with something that's just going to stay pretty tense and pretty dynamic. I'm not confident that it's going to end in some like Dayton Accord. If you remember the way that one of the Balkans wars ended in the mid 1990s, it just doesn't feel like the formula is in place. And then part of what made that war come to an end was that the United States stepped in and we put our military in to sort of force the Milosevic government to concede. And I just think, for the reasons we talked about earlier, no U.S. president is going to be eager to send U.S. troops into Ukraine.
Aren't there already troops there? There's some that have been deployed there covertly as of recently.
I'm talking about a U.S. military operation on the ground in Ukraine. There's nothing like that that I'm aware of.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
I can ask one. Yeah. Okay, I'll ask one since I've been here. Hi, I'm Sharina. So that focus on that young people, on your target audience for number 2, what would you ask a elementary school, a middle schooler, and a high schooler after they read the book? What question would you ask them? What kind of is the thing that you want to drive home?
I guess the question would be, why is Russia different than a lot of countries? And also, what makes it similar to the United States in a lot of ways? And so, part of what makes the United States and Russia similar, to answer the question, is we have always sort of believed that we have some exalted purpose in the world. And czars, going back to the Middle Ages, have sort of identified Russia as having this special mission, and that Russia would be a center of world civilization, and that it had to have this outsized impact on the world stage. And so that is sort of baked into the notion of what makes Russia, Russia. And Putin has really embraced all of that. So there's this notion of the Third Rome and these things that we all hear about, but they are pretty cardinal to the way Russian leaders have defined their role in the world.
I'm David Falk, and I lived in the neighborhood. I know you can't get into Putin's head, but what do you think he realistically thinks of the fleeing of, 300,000, 500,000 young Russians, intelligent and educated Russians, the IT industry, and so on?
It's a really good question. It's also just a great insurance policy for Vladimir Putin. The more that unhappy people leave and they keep the borders open, the safer he is. So it's a safety valve, and it basically creates a mechanism for the most sort of globalized and self-starting people in the country to punk out, and for the people who are left behind to be the most passive and paternalist and dependent members of Russian society.